Hi, everyone. My name is J.D. Talasic, and I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. If you joined us last week for the first of 3 Around Nature discussions, welcome back. If you are joining us for the first time, I'm glad you're with us. If you would like to join in the discussion or ask questions during today's event, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This series looks at the historic Magellan-Elcano expedition through a multidisciplinary socio-botanical lens. Yet, as we heard last week, there is much to learn from our past and to understand the world we live in today. The conceptual framework for this series was created by our wonderful colleagues at the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy, along with artist Juanli Carrión. Juanli is one of our panelists today, but he will also we'll also hear a few closing remarks from him at the end of the discussion. So please stay with us through the end. The mission of cultural programs of the National Academy of Sciences is to explore the intersections of art, science, and culture. And this series is a perfect example of how we strive to do this. You can find more information on CPNAS programs on this series and to register for the final discussion next week at CPNAS. Today's Around Nature panel is entitled The Trade of Nature. And to introduce and moderate this discussion, I'd like to introduce you to Blanca de la Torre. Blanca is an art historian, curator, and writer who specializes in the intersections of art, ecology, and sustainability. So I'd like to welcome Blanca. Blanca, thank you for leading today's discussion.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I think we have a broad audience today coming from many parts of the world. We have around 400 people from 26 different countries, I think. So thank you, the team of the National Academy of Sciences, Juanli, Ernesto, and the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy for organizing such a relevant symposium, an event that seems absolutely necessary during these times of turmoil. As JD mentioned, we are here today on the occasion of the 5th centenary of the trip around the world accomplished by Magallanes and Juan Sebastián Elcano, and to discuss the consequences of this trip and the globalization from past to present. The focus of the panel today will be to address the different trade-offs between globalization and climate change, and the role and importance of issues like environmental justice, activism, education, food, or biodiversity extension. And to do so, we have here a brilliant selection of speakers that will share their insights of expertise, like Shaheen Naeem, who is a professor of ecology in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, and director of the Earth Institute Center for Environmental Sustainability at Columbia University. He also studies the ecological and environmental consequences of biodiversity loss. We also have with us Diana Ayton-Shenker. She is CEO of Leonardo International Society of the Arts, Sciences, and Technology, Executive Director of the Arizona State University-Leonardo Initiative, and Professor of Practice at ASU's School for the Future of Innovation in Society and School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. Also, Daniel Stone, a writer on environmental science, agriculture, and botany in Washington, D.C., and he writes for National Geographic and is a former White House correspondent for Newsweek and The Daily Beast. He also teaches environmental policy at Johns Hopkins University, and he's the author of The Food Explorer on the botanical adventures of a food spy. And finally, Juanli Carrión, who is an artist and researcher whose work unfolds in the development and education of community-engaged design and artistic practices. Juanli, in 2017, founded OSS Project, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to build public gardens as art interventions using urban farming, educational programming, and community building. And we're going to start with Shaheen Naeem.
Right. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and how nice it is to be able to participate in this remarkable, I guess you called it sort of the 500th anniversary, I suppose, of this international expedition. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go. So I hope that looks okay. But I thought I'd start out with this particular image, in part because it has a modern view of what it would look like if Magellan and Elcano left today. It's a very, very different world. And part of the reason that it's very, very different is because of that expedition. But the real reason I wanted to show this slide, aside from it featuring Spain there, is that if you look up here at the horizon, there's this very, very thin blue line, blue-greenish, almost sort of transparent line. And what's important about that, and something that nobody could have seen 500 years ago, in fact, even just a little while ago, we didn't have the spaceships that could see this, is that this separates Earth from what I call cosmic death, much to the annoyance of my colleagues in astronomy who find this really quite beautiful. I find it quite frightening that on the outside of this little tiny border here is a vacuum near absolute zero temperature and all kinds of deadly radiation. And somehow that protects the living world. And it was not long ago that, in the 1960s, that James Lovelock first formulated his argument for why this is so. And he did so as an atmospheric chemist by looking at a geological model of Venus and Mars. And you might imagine if Mars and Venus got together and had a child, Earth would be that child. But this is what Earth would look like. Its atmosphere would be mostly carbon dioxide, nitrogen would be fairly scarce, oxygen would be almost non-existent, the temperature would be well above boiling, and the atmospheric pressure would be 60 times what it is today, quite crushing. But the biotic Earth, or Earth with life on it, is actually one that's quite pleasant. Not so much CO2 in the atmosphere, a remarkable amount of oxygen and nitrogen, and a very comfortable temperature of around 13 degrees Celsius globally. Some places are warmer, some places are cooler, but this is all because life makes our planet the comfortable environment that we know. So if we go back to why, what motivated the expedition, it was spices. And back then it was just a few spices that primarily motivated, they were worth quite a bit of money. And we might consider that if the original request was for nutmeg, clove, cinnamon, and maybe a few others like black pepper, today the global spice trade is at $10.2 billion. Unfortunately, Spain doesn't control it, although I think they had hoped to do so. And we're talking about 200 spices that are traded in the active market. That might seem a lot, but what I would like to talk about today is biological diversity and the diversity of vegetation. And if you consider this FAO report on what's called neglected crops, there are actually about 30,000 edible plant species that are out there. And but we only cultivate about 6,000 to 7,000 of them, which is just startling to me that our diets, which seem rich, are actually missing out on a lot. And then if you actually think about what are the dominant crops that are commercially significant, it's only about 170, and then about almost most of that involves only about 30 species in our food supply, and then only 3 of them provide almost half of the calories, and that's rice and wheat and maize, corn. So to me, as somebody who studies biological diversity, it's even more astonishing that there are 400,000 species on Earth, and we're using a microscopic amount of that diversity to feed ourselves. But what's interesting, of course, is that to feed ourselves, we've actually had quite an impact on the world. Let's take a look at the vegetation to get a sense of how that is. And this is from NASA. It's a compilation of the greenness of the world over time. Some of you may have seen this before, but I always love it because it shows how, as the season progresses, you have the northern hemisphere greening up in the summer and the southern hemisphere greening up in our winter, I being in the northern hemisphere. And it oscillates back and forth between the north and the south, and it gives you this sense, when speeded up, that Earth is a living planet, and it's breathing. it's sort of inhaling and expiring much the way living organisms do. And what's neat about that is if you actually look at the CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time, many of us are familiar with the steady climb over a long period of time of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which is one of the main causes for climate change. And if you look in the southern hemisphere, there's not that much land down there, but you can see that the CO2 goes up when there is very little vegetation in their winter, and then it goes down as the vegetation absorbs that carbon dioxide. In the northern hemisphere, where there's much more land, you can see those same peaks. The peak occurs in the winter when there's not much photosynthesis going on, then it declines and then it climbs, and you can see the sort of respiratory pattern of the Earth. But if I was a doctor and I was looking at the Earth and wondering about its respiration, it looks to me like Earth is under some kind of respiratory stress as things are getting more and more exacerbated. So back in 2012, we celebrated 20 years of biodiversity and ecosystem function research. I was invited to write an article that sort of captured what it was we had found out over those 20 years. And rather than going through the thousands of papers and studies that have been done, I think this diagram captures it all. The idea is that over 3.5 billion years, we've had about 10 million species now that have been distributed in every nook and cranny of the world, from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the highest mountains. And these species are adapted to the environments that they live in. We divide those habitats into biomes or ecosystems, but any one you look at, whether it's a forested ecosystem or a grassland or a marine system, you can see that they're all being changed to agricultural or into aquacultural or seafood businesses. And by so doing, what we're doing is keeping the biomes still as they are, but we're lowering biodiversity. And this transformation to the production of food is the primary reason that biodiversity is declining. Yes, there's extinction that's occurring from overexploitation or from hunting and other things, but the primary reason that we've lost biodiversity is because of agriculture. And what this diagram also reminds us of is that that very thin shield that is protecting us from cosmic death is actually the product of the biological activities of 1 trillion tons of organisms. And 1 trillion tons is just the carbon. We're not including the water, just 1 trillion tons of organisms around our planet. But getting back to what's happened, in our quest for food, and especially with a global market and global transportation that allows food to be distributed all over the world, we've taken a world that consists of these ecosystems, which I showed you just 3 before, and have now converted many of them to either croplands or pastures and rangelands. And while there are many properties about these that don't differ too much, there's still grasslands, there's still forests, there's still aquatic systems or marine systems, they are all vastly lower in biological diversity. And what I refer to that is as biotic impoverishment, in that each of these systems here has a much lower amount of biodiversity than it would if we look at the natural system. So what is biotic impoverishment? I think it's an important term, and I'd like to spend a little time to defend it. One is that biodiversity loss, I feel, is frequently conflated with mass extinction, which is on everybody's mind, and it is a big problem, but the Anthropocene is not about mass extinction, it's about biotic impoverishment. If we go forward a few million years and dig back through the ground to look at the fossil record, it isn't that we'll find that the dodo disappeared or that the great auk disappeared or that perhaps the polar bear will have disappeared shortly. What we will find is that everywhere we look, there are very few species, almost everywhere we look, compared to what it was before humans arrived and the period became called the Anthropocene. So biotic impoverishment is about how every unit area of volume on any place on Earth has declined in all its dimensions of diversity. And what I mean by that is taxonomic, functional, genetic, genomic, phylogenetic diversity. Scientists don't just count the number of species, we're actually interested in all the dimensions of diversity, and they've all declined. So how do we do that? I thought as a scientist, I would want to share with you at least one study, so I'm going to choose a study that we did. Here's an example. This is where I work in the Alaskan tundra, and it's north of the Brooks Range in Alaska. These are my colleagues, students, postdocs, Kevin Griffin, and just to show you that, you know, it is a remarkably diverse area in the summer where the sun never sets. All these birds migrate, some as far away as from the continent of Africa to come and enjoy the sort of bounty that's there. And when you look at it, the plant diversity is equally astonishing. They may be all small stature plants, but they're really quite diverse. You go and put a box on top of it and measure the amount of carbon dioxide in that box, you will find that if taxonomic diversity varies, if functional diversity varies, if phylogenetic diversity varies, the rate of carbon dioxide flux through that box is affected by biodiversity. If you do this through many, many systems with many organisms, plants, animals, microorganisms, you will find after thousands of studies that anytime you change biodiversity, you will change the way the ecosystem functions. I won't go through this list because I think many of you know that pollination, seed dispersal, decomposition, prevention of erosion, carbon cycling is all really, really affected by biological diversity. And I think also if you look at all of the different sort of plans or schematics of how we believe the world is operating, even if we go back hundreds of years, the idea is that our well-being, this brown box, is affected by the biological world, biodiversity. And these red boxes represent how we impact them and how they impact us. And these are frameworks for many different international organizations that we reviewed in a paper not long ago. So how do you encapsulate so complex an idea as biotic impoverishment? This is how I do it. If you keep losing ingredients, I would argue that eventually paella is just rice. I think that's apt for today. If you keep losing spices, eventually curry is just salt. If you keep losing parts, eventually all you have is junk. And if you keep losing species, eventually all you have is, I'm not going to answer that question. I mean, that answer, I'm going to leave it for you to fill in the blank. And I'm going to stop there if I can.
Thanks, Ahid. That was brilliant. And now we give the word to Diana Ayton-Shenker.
Okay. Thank you so much. I loved that presentation. I'm going to share with you slides. Go. And I will put this in presentation mode. Thanks for your patience. Here we go. So one of the things that I loved about Shahid's presentation is opening with that image that allowed us to see ourselves in the world in a new way. And I think that that opening up of seeing ourselves around nature in a new way is an underlying core commonality between the voyage of Magellan Elcano in launching forward this process of globalization. Globalization helps us see each other and ourselves in the world in a new way, and the empathy that that can engender around nature. So I want to talk about empathy and suggest that globalization as inextricably connected to these pivotal moments in our history, such as the expedition of Magellan Elcano and the voyage we now undertake through art and science can expand our experience of empathy for nature. But I also want to suggest that it's not just empathy for nature, as if we are somehow separated out and humanity is looking to become better stewards, as if we are the owners of nature or somehow separated out, but it's empathy of nature, recognizing that we are part of our natural world. And just as we steward, we also steward ourselves and have empathy for ourselves. So when we encounter, envision, and engage with nature in new ways, we can begin to empathize because we identify differently. And we've seen this from the experience of Earthrise, this iconic image that Bill Anders shared, inspired by that first moment of seeing Earth rise up from the view of outer space. We literally could see ourselves in a globalized, global new way. And I'm going to suggest that empathy around nature and in general comes from breaking down bias and expanding interconnectedness. So sometimes globalization is defined as interconnectedness, but I would suggest that in addition to globalization as a state of interconnectedness, it's also a process of both expanding and creating interconnectedness, and of revealing and exposing the interconnectedness that's already there. So if we're going to break down bias, we need to know what our biases are around nature. So I thought I'd begin with a little exercise. And we're going to take a look at these scenes from nature. So everyone's seen this. Okay. 1, 2, 3. We've had a little bit of time. And now, let's see. I'm going to ask, what did you see? You don't have to answer because you're all muted. But I can tell you that when this study was done, what people see is quite likely to be a lion, a bird, maybe you saw the elephants, perhaps the alligator. What there is in this grid, however, is an equal number of plants and animals. And the study revealed a kind of plant blindness that we have, a bias towards animals, things with faces, things we identify with because we feel connected. To expand that empathy around nature and open up our eyes to the natural world around us, including plant life in the biology we empathize with, we connect with. Another study was done that asked participants to look at images of natural harm. That is to say, harm in nature. So they were shown 2 images, an image that we can all conjure in our mind quite tragically, of a seagull or a bird washed up on the shore, dying, covered in oil from an oil spill, and an image of trees cut down. When participants were asked to look at these pictures and describe them, they were able to do so without a lot of empathy. However, and they felt more empathy for the animal than the plant. However, when they were asked instead of describe this to say, imagine how the bird feels, imagine how the trees feel. Just being asked to imagine how the trees feel had the response of empathy and action. Not only did the participants feel for the trees and the natural empathy for plants, they then took action, donating money or volunteering time on behalf of that issue. So question that I want to ask us in breaking down bias and moving to expand interconnectedness so that we can increase our empathy with nature is, what would Leo do? What would Leonardo do? So I'm coming from Leonardo, the International Society of Art, Science, Technology, where we aspire to embody and embolden arts, science, strategies, and synergies that create inroads for solutions to our problems today that could uplift globalization as a force for interconnectedness and empathy with nature. With Leonardo as our iconic inspiration, he didn't separate out art, science, and the issues of his time, nor a separation of the human from the natural world. He recognized that studying and through art, a depiction of disaster featured on the left of your screen, of human anatomy in the middle, and of the whirls of water on the right, were all part of the same spectrum of how we empathize with nature, how interconnected we are with our natural environment. So through that lens of art science, I want to share a couple examples of how through Leonardo and our colleagues in the world of art science, we're seeking to expand empathy through art science initiatives. So the first example I just want to share with you is one by Pantea Carini, who created these beautiful installations inspired by a 12th century herbal guide to healing properties of herbs, written 12th century in Andalusia, written by Dr. Al-Kafiki, the Herbal of Kafiki. And she took these beautiful drawings of medicinal herbs, like the spices sought after in the Magellan Elcano expedition that followed. And she said, how can we use these images to experience them empathetically, to increase our empathy of how we feel for nature? So with an installation, printing these designs on foldable screens, we were able to expand that empathy, looking at through this wheel, the healing properties of herbs, and smell the scents of such herbs as we walk through the installation. Spela Petrick, looking at the conundrum of plant life, seeks to confront vegetal otherness and move past empathy to our interface between human experience and vegetal growth as interconnected. Augustine Luder shares the immersive experience by sonifying electrophysiological signals of plants and the way that trees and underground systems communicate. And then finally, David Dunn, composer and artist, attributes bioacoustic communication in insect infestation to show us the music of microecology and present some non-toxic but actual sound strategies to help with fighting deforestation in our expanded empathy for nature. So when we look at what Leonardo would do, we can see that expanding empathy around nature through our interconnectedness and bias breakdown is interconnected with globalization, art, and science.
Thank you, Diana. That was magnificent. And now we go with Daniel Stone.
Thank you so much. I think everyone can hear me and hopefully see me. Great. Shahid, Diana, I was wrapped with attention from what you were talking about, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, but I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to join all of you. Give me one moment to share my screen with you all. Here we go. Perfect. Again, my name is Daniel Stone. I am a writer on nature and ecology. I write for National Geographic magazine and also published this book about the topic of our time today, The Food Explorer, about the globalization of our food and some of the history behind it that I want to take you through a little bit today. We'll start with this map that I often like to show of some of the crop origins that we think of as central to our lives today. And as Shahid was talking about, there are thousands, perhaps even millions of edible food crops around the world, but we've really narrowed it down to a very narrow slice. And you could look around the world here and see some of our favorite crops, favorite foods, and where they come from, right? The avocados that many of us love in the West and in Europe and in America, from Mexico. Many of our types of berries, especially that we grow in Spain and France now, come from South America near Chile. Coffee, we know, of course, in Ethiopia and Eastern Africa. All citrus comes from China, bananas from Papua New Guinea, and apples from Central and Northern Asia around Kazakhstan. And this is really interesting when you think of sort of the globalization behind why now we eat what we eat and why we don't eat those other thousands of other crops, edible food crops. And it's a matter of globalization. It's a matter of change and time and really of exploration. And I want to tell you about one main explorer here of many that have done this work for centuries on behalf of their countries. For so long, really the way to enrich a country, the way to grow it economically and boost its standing in the world was through food. And this is a man on the left side here, the headshot of a man named David Fairchild, who I wrote about in my book, The Food Explorer. And he was a food adventurer, a food spy, I call him, for the US government, sent to circle the world in search of novel crops that he could find in other countries and introduce back to America. Now, this was a process, again, that many countries and many explorers were doing in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries to try to enrich and diversify their crop diversity in their countries in hopes to fortify their economy. Fairchild takes a very classic type of travel in the 19th century, a steamship across oceans. He visits more than 52 countries, all of them by boat, in hopes of finding these crops. And he has a lot of success. Here on the left is a photo he took in Corsica, where he was sent to acquire, as you see on the right, a type of Corsican citron, a citrus variety that was very classic and the best grown in Corsica, in the Mediterranean. And he introduced those back to California, where they helped grow the California citrus industry, which is now known for, of course, its navel oranges and grapefruits and lemons, many of which came during this central and pivotal era. Here on the left, another classic food, the avocado, that Fairchild picked up in Chile and introduced back to the US through Washington, DC, where it was sent to propagation stations across the United States and shared with farmers. Again, this process was being done by a lot of different countries. Fairchild is just one of many of these types of explorers. And America really had a central part of avocado innovation throughout the 20th century, to the point that on the right side of your screen, if you could see, is a patent for the Hass avocado that we eat today that was filed by a Southern Californian postal worker named Rudolf Hass in 1935, who patented the world's most popular avocado now. Fairchild went to Baghdad, where he picks up dates and introduces them back again to California, a very fertile slice of land on Earth, where dates become a central industry in Southern California and in the eastern part of the state toward Palm Springs, a desert-like climate very similar to Baghdad and much of the Middle East. And Fairchild has ornamental successes too. The cherry blossom trees that are now so famous in Washington, DC, originally came from Japan. We know that. Fairchild spent the entire summer of 1903 in Japan, where he picks up the first cherry blossom trees and introduces them to America, where eventually, about a decade later, they're introduced and they are grown around some of the most classic monuments and buildings in Washington, DC to help beautify the city. This is Fairchild's work, and he does it thousands more times with many other crops at a time when a lot of other people are doing this same work. And it's really the first phase of this globalization of our food, of crossing borders, of making the world smaller and making more common what we eat, and across cultures, across borders, across barriers. This is a map that I call the fruits of Fairchild, just Fairchild's successes. And you could see everywhere he went in the world and what he picked up, from the avocados I mentioned, and watermelons, types of pineapples, types of nectarines and dates, citrus varieties, seedless grapes, all things that did not previously grow commercially in the United States that are now behemoth industries all over the world. And when we think of kind of foods that catch on and foods that don't, I'll go back to that slide. You could see on the bottom right, that little purple fruit with the white wedges. You know, why do some fruits catch on but others don't? And Shahid talked about this, why we eat just that narrow slice of all the available crops on Earth. And it really gets at the question of commercial ability. And that's something that wasn't really a factor 200, 300 years ago, but is everything in food right now. Can a food like this fruit down on the bottom right, which many of you, certainly in Southeast Asia, will recognize as the mangosteen, or here on the right as the personal-sized pineapple, why can we not find those in most Western markets or in regions with climates that don't support them? And the answer is really one of climate, efficiency, and commercial ability. Can this fruit, and can any fruit, be grown at scale? Can it be shipped with efficiency? Can it stay in its structural integrity over thousands of miles and over several days or even weeks? And can it still look perfect by the time you find it in a supermarket and pick it up with no bruises? If it has any bruises, as you know, you won't buy it. Probably I wouldn't either. And that's why we only have the powerhouse crops, apples, bananas, oranges, so to speak, that we could find anywhere in the world that are really classic because they're really durable. And that gets us back, wrapping up, to this map that I showed at the beginning of this globalization of crops. These all had their original geographic origins, and now they're everywhere. And now they can be grown fairly ubiquitously. They can be grown with greater ease, with greater efficiency, and at far greater scale. And that poses a lot of questions, I think, that are relevant to our discussion today about just the nature of what is farming in the 21st century. Who is farming? Who are the consumers? And what role do we all give them in our global economy and sort of our global nature of working and consumption? And I just show this last slide as a kind of a metric of, you know, as a reminder of how we think of agricultural workers, indigenous people, of some of the richest people in the world and some of the poorest countries in the world, and how we combine them all through the fabric of agriculture and food, and how they're all important constituencies to remember in how we talk about these issues.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Food and food for thought.
Thank you, Bia.
That was very compelling. We will finish the presentations with Juanli Carrión.
Thank you, Blanca, Daniel, Diana, Shahid. My whole body of work as artists, researchers, and educator has been addressing for the past 10 years social and environmental justice issues. And the design of Around Nature's Garden, the project that inspires and frames this symposium, will visualize with plants, size, and color not only the botanical route that illustrates Magallanes and Elcano trip around the world, but also the current ethnographic and ecological capital realities of the different stops of the trip, with the intention to present the good and the bad consequences of the trip, and hopefully spark a discussion on how we can use this good to remediate the bad. I'm going to share, today I'm going to present 3 of my most recent projects. And before I start, I want to mention that Shahid talked about the Anthropocene, Diana was telling us about interconnection, and Daniel was talking about commercial ability, the commercial ability. It is very interesting because like all these subjects are subjects that I have worked in the past in my projects. I would like to start with this presentation with PHY, since this project was also curated by our moderator, Blanca de la Torre. PHY is an art, hold on a second. PHY is an art and research project that uses scientific method behind natural dye processes to visualize the water pollution on the Yamuna River in India. One of the more important factors of the dyeing process is the quality of the water, and by instance, the pH of the water, which affects directly the resulting color of the dye. This map that you're seeing here shows the 10 stops that we did along the Yamuna River. In each stop, I dyed pieces of felt using mother roots, and then the resulting textiles reveal the different levels of contamination in the water in a variety of shades ranging from bright red to pale orange. The fact that the Yamuna River flows through several industrial cities, it caused a price to this river. And we're talking about industrial dumping, outdated sewage systems, overpopulation, saturated landfills, cattle washing, and many other issues that have poisoned this sacred river to become one of the most polluted rivers in the world. To the point that after the Taj Mahal, the mix of agricultural, industrial, and human waste gives a neutral pH 6.5 to the water, which is far from a sign of good water. It is actually a sign of balance of pollutants, where the amount of agricultural and industrial waste, which tends to be acidic, neutralize the sewage, and the human waste, which tends to be alkaline, making the water like very, very hazardous. This trip that we did along the river and the process of dyeing all these pieces of felt is documented in a 14-minute video that also presents the conclusions about pollution revealed by the project. And the images that you are seeing here are stills from that video. And here is the resulting mural, which reveals with color the same results than other studies, like the one that you see in the graphic on the bottom right of the slide, that shows the average dissolved oxygen in the river at different points. The second project I want to present is Culinarialismos, which is a series of culinary actions in the form of performance, workshops, and participatory sculptures, in which I use the recipe as a choreographic instruction to reveal the historical or cultural importance of gastronomic appropriations. These are some of the maps that trace the history of food staples of our contemporary cuisine around the world. In this series, I use the history of these ingredients to address current conflicts where the actions take place. And the participants of these actions eat, cook, harvest, or wear food as an opportunity for collectivity, for knowledge sharing, and collaborative creation. For example, I use peppers in Murcia, Spain, to talk about idiosyncrasy, cultural appropriation, and colonialism, cooking a meal for 300 residents of Ceuta, a town in my region, which economy and gastronomy relays on the production of pepper, while pepper come originally from Mesoamerica. I also used potatoes in a food truck in Lima, Peru, to denounce the illegal mining practices permitted by the Peruvian government in protected indigenous land that is destroying not only communities, but also ecosystems across the country. The food stand served fried potatoes in the shape of the regions affected by the mining during the VIP reception of the Arford Park. And I also use corn in a series of cooking workshops and installation in New York to investigate the role of this crop in global economies through history and how the iconography used by the pre-Columbian civilizations can be found in the logos of corporations like Starbucks, Citgo, Chevron, or HSBC that are today engaging on different forms of economic colonization in the countries where corn was originated. A new edition of this series is programmed to use the ingredients grown in a round nature's garden to address some of the consequences of Magallanes and Elcano first trip around the world. And I would like to finish with Outer Seed Shadow, a project that takes its name from the definition of minorities in plant migrations between ecosystems. Between 2014 and 2016, I partnered with communities in New York, Spain, and Sweden to build gardens that serve as platforms to empower, celebrate, and reclaim identity and knowledge. These geopolitical gardens materialize the union between plants and human interaction by using different plant species as representatives of social groups and individuals illustrating unrecognized social ecosystems. These living sculptures also serve as a centerpiece to articulate public programming that further discusses the ideas addressed in the gardens. For the first garden, 36 foreign-born residents of Manhattan were interviewed at their homes to recount their experiences of arrival and adaptation. And each of them selected a plant to represent them, and these plants were planted according to their district of residency in Manhattan, in a Manhattan-shaped garden. The interactions between plants on this impossible garden were used as a base for a series of gardening workshops developed with local organizations in downtown Manhattan. It was also immigration what inspired the garden in Brooklyn, the refugee crisis in Valencia, Spain, self-determination in Malmö, Sweden, and food literacy in the Bronx. And finally, in 2017, and in partnership with Jackie Fisher, OSS incorporated as a nonprofit organization whose mission is now to connect artists with communities to continue developing these powerful forms of sustainable creative placemaking. Thank you.
Thank you all for those inspiring presentations. Now I have some specific questions for each of you. I will start with Zahid. So your research has demonstrated the long-term damage caused by biodiversity loss on ecosystems. The mainstream poster child of this might be the polar bear, which has become something of a cliche since such losses occur all through the food chain down to the tiniest microbes. So in your opinion, what are the most overlooked and significant losses occurring since that first world trip of Magallanes Elcano? And how are they impacting the natural world right now? And do you have any thoughts on what the solutions could look like and how they might be communicated to those in a position to implement them?
Well, thanks for the question. Interesting, I had to move inside because the farmer across the way has actually decided to harvest his hayfield today. So his harvester is making too much noise. I moved inside. So this constant connection between the production of agriculture and anything we're doing. I think that it's difficult to sort of separate out all the different changes that had occurred. Many which started from the idea that we could actually obtain resources, whether they're agricultural or not, from all around the world and bring them to places where there was a market for them. Food for us is the most important one. Interestingly, economically, especially today, food does not command most of the global economy. It's sort of interesting. That in fact, if you look at most of the poorest countries in the world, their primary economy is actually food and agriculture. But then if you consider that there's sort of a feedback, that globalization led to the ability for food and trade to occur at a very large scale, that helped population to grow. Population to grow, then led for need for more food and more resources. It also, speaking to Juanli's concerns, it also intensified inequality. And these sorts of things are what I think create two problems. One is that we have biotic impoverization. So the loss of the polar bear or the panda or the snow leopard are tragedies that many of us are concerned with. But it tends to make us forget that, and I think you pointed this out, that there's also a loss of the microbial world, there's a loss of plant world, there's a loss of the fungal world. And that is the sort of thing which is making our ecosystems much more fragile. Responding to climate change is not going to be easy with low biodiversity. And so I think that the thing that needs to be done is to reverse biotic impoverization. I think setting up wildlife reserves in which you build a fence around and try to save a little patch of land is an important thing to do. But more importantly, as some of the things we've seen in terms of our art, in terms of action, whether it's about justice or just about production, is to diversify everything. Diversify your garden, get rid of your lawns, diversify your lawns, diversify wherever you can. Here in New York City, the idea that we can diversify our parks more than they are is a good thing to do. And not be distracted by things like the penguins and the polar bear. if we can diversify the world in addition to save some of what's left, we can restore, I think, the resilience of our planet.
That sounds like a big challenge. And this brings me to Diana. So Diana, in your book, A New Global Agenda, you explore the most compelling global challenges of our time. You actually offer a very pragmatic perspective. You mentioned that we need practices, strategies, and conversations. You speak about how things like the importance of international cooperation and multilateralism are. And also the book is quite new. It barely has 2 years now, but the world has changed all of a sudden. So how can we understand better the importance of the tips that you offer in the current context, when the path you suggest probably got a wider dimension? And would you change or add anything new to the book in relation to the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you for that question and for the opportunity to be together. Thank you to the Cultural Program, the National Academy of Science, and the Spanish Embassy, the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy. Yes, I would make changes, and I would also say that a new global agenda as envisioned 2 years ago is somehow more relevant than ever. So I did revisit my book. Here it is, New Global Agenda. It's so pretty. And I did revisit this in the last week or so in the context of COVID, thinking, gosh, is this even relevant today? How would it stand up? You know, within 2 years of putting out this collective effort of identifying practices, pathways, priorities for the international community, the world changed, as you said, but it did and it didn't. I think, you know, the world has been revealed to us differently from this crisis. The world's still here. And the challenges that preceded the emergence and our awareness of the coronavirus were still there. Not yet solved, not yet fully addressed, but in this mix. What this crisis does is accelerate the urgency, but also the awareness that we are interconnected, that these issues, the challenges of inequity and biodiversity and how we share this planet and our relationship to nature are still there. It's just that much more urgent. We're that much more aware. So I guess there are three things that I would say about a new global agenda as a pathway for affecting change. And I especially appreciated Shahid's call to action to diversify everything. So that might be one new thing. But the first thing is to introduce new terms and new maybe techniques. One term I would use, I would emphasize that was in the book is to diversify, but I like that, diversify everything, call to action. But also, as we learned last week, I learned a new term from our colleague, John McNeil, of looking at this current context as a syndemic, not just the pandemic, but this pandemic crisis in the context of other challenges and crises around us, the crises of forced migration, of climate change, of economic and social inequity and injustice. These crises have a confluence that affect how we respond. So maybe introduce the term of syndemic, introduce the idea of environmental personhood and what it might mean to be giving equal weight to our natural environment in this anthropocentric climate. And then finally, change the way that we get these ideas out. So in addition to the books that we're really proud of and that we work so hard on or we're inspired by, really engaging with arts and science and citizen experience so that we are much, much more inclusive and diverse in our way of communicating and changing global citizen behavior. I think that that's one way that we will accelerate how we can become more human and more humane by advancing a new global agenda.
Thank you, Diana. We need books like that in these difficult times. And we need also books like Daniel's. Daniel, in the book that you just spoke about, The Food Explorer, you charted the exploits of David Fairchild and his discovery of new foods, just as it was with Magallanes and Elcano. So we see science and commerce get bound together very easily and willingly. And you create a very vivid imagery of the complex relationship between Fairchild and his patron, Berbor Lathrop. So much of our evolution as eaters has come from quite good intentions, but has often resulted in monocultures, environmental degradation, and even genocide. So what do you think we can and should learn from the way we have expanded our diets at such cost? And as the President of the United States continues to vilify journalists, please reflect on the role of the media in ecological reporting.
Wow, small question at the end. Yeah, no, I'm happy to, very happy to. It's a really interesting question, and it affects all of our lives every day, which is one of the beautiful parts of science. When it comes to food and this sense of globalization and monocultures and oppression and inequality around the world, I think that was the inevitable effect of the very rapid industrialization of our food, of finding the world smaller, of finding countries more interconnected, which made some countries more vulnerable to exploitation. And that's really why we find ourselves where we do today. But I think the most important thing, to answer your question, is that we all really know about the origins of our food, and not the 100-year-ago origins, but really recognizing what goes into the food chain from the farmer, the grower, the harvester, the shipper, the seller, and all the people involved to get what we have toward us. The effect of that, I think, at least it's been for me and my family, is we eat a lot more local food. We have a garden where we try to grow as much as we can. And that's not available for every person in every climate around the world. But that sort of intimacy with food makes you sort of confront those questions in a way that a lot of people don't. That, you know, you buy something, you have no idea who grew it, you have no idea who sold it, you have no idea sort of all the effort that went into it. And just knowing that much of that process, it's the same thing as sort of just knowing the size of your carbon footprint affects your decisions in every area of life. You know, if you know that the decisions you make with your car, with your travel, with what you're eating, with what your money is invested in, whatever, are polluting the planet, you would probably choose to make slight changes. And I think that's true with our food too. And as long as I've been talking about these issues and this book that I wrote, it's people come to that on their own. You know, they interpret their own lifestyle with the same, you know, level of scrutiny that they feel comfortable with. But even small changes in that area, I think, add up to a fair amount of progress. And to your second question about the media, sorry to point, about the media, I think now, you know, that COVID-19 sort of lays this on even thicker. But to Diana's point, this was sort of a elaborate and trend that was going on for a long time and is now accelerating. The fact that local news and national and international news are more important than ever. And, you know, reporters have always been used to people not liking some element of coverage, right? Now it's the President of the United States, but it's always been, you know, people can interpret the news how they want, but that shouldn't affect how we report it, how we tell it, and how people consume it to make their own decisions. And so as a reporter with a lot of reporter colleagues, I'm going to keep doing that. And I think all of us have no choice but to just keep doing that, because the news will outlive any critic at the moment, from the president down to, you know, the youngest person alive. And the news really impacts all our lives and holds accountability for the injustices that we see around the world. So I'm going to keep at it, and I hope others do too.
Thank you, Daniel. I go with Juanli now. While we both work in the art realm and with similar focus on political ecology, practices of the commons, and environmental justice. So one of the key issues would be how to reflect about any trace of nature when we have to see ourselves as nature, living with and not on the land. And what are your thoughts on this? And what role do you see art and culture having to help create more ecologically sustainable relationships with nature?
Well, I think that like in the presentations of the panelists, we have gone, I said it also, I pointed it out before my presentation, but like, I'm gonna say it again. Shahid talked about the Anthropocene, and that is something we have to think about to answer this question. And Diana focused her presentation in interconnection. And like that is also connected to this word of Anthropocene. And like finally, this idea of commercial ability, which for me connects with our current system, which is capitalism, that Daniel pointed out. And for the past 5 years, I have been working on my PhD dissertation and researching on how we can make creative placemaking sustainable, okay? And I'm now in the process of writing the conclusions for this. And one of the most revealing conclusions is the fact that the art, as a reflection of our time, is mirroring exactly that's the social phenomena that we are witnessing, right? And that is that the time of individual artists with universal messages and great masters of the art that has like this visionary, unique way of making art is changing, right? And like this vision of universal images and messages aligns perfectly with modernism, right? Like this idea of modernism and this idea of anthropocentric thought, and by instance with capitalism, with the capitalist agenda. All this is changing to a more, in my opinion, and after my research, to a more collective experience, to a more interconnected experience in which artists are working along with communities and other experts in other fields, more into multidisciplinary fields, in creating multiverses and aligning more with like an ecocentric agenda instead of like an anthropocentric agenda. And I just want to clarify that this ecocentric agenda is not new. This is not something that like is new. It has been always the agenda of many communities around the world, and which have been silenced or ignored by Eurocentric impositions. And to talk about these Eurocentric impositions, we can talk about the trip of Magallanes Elcano, about colonialism, and so on. But like, I just want to like, to answer this question, I want to talk about like ethical relationality, which is a term coined by a Native American Papache Chase Cree scholar, Dwayne Donnell, and he uses this term to describe not only how we should interact among each other using this ethical relationality, but also how we should interact with nature. And I think that it is the time for art to join this idea too.
Thank you. And now I have a couple of questions for all of you. I'm very curious about your different perspectives. So the first one has to do with zoonotic disease. One of the most dangerous traits of nature has emerged once again, that of the trafficking of endangered wild animals, resulting in another zoonotic disease. While we do not have definitive proof of the origins of COVID-19, scientists think it likely jumped from bats to endangered pangolins and then to humans at a so-called wet market for bushmeat. But why do you think humans have maintained such outmoded appetites within our globalized marketplace? Who wants to start? Maybe Daniel? Or Shahid?
Shahid, please.
Well, I was going to say that I think it's my perspective is it's a bit from the biodiversity side, not surprisingly, is that looking for the cause, such as whether it jumped from an animal to a human, or whether eating bushmeat or eating other animals is an outmoded form of a food practice, is different from, you know, why it actually was a problem. And the reason that zoonotic diseases and emerging diseases in general, especially the viral ones, are a problem, is because there are many more people on the planet. They're living closer to one another. They're highly mobile. And then when you actually look at trying to contain a disease outbreak, we have lots of economic, social, and cultural issues that come up that prevent the problem. So, I mean, prevent us to be able to bring the disease under control. And so, is it really, you know, let's say, you know, it turns out that it was somebody who ate an exotic animal like a pangolin or something like that. Well, I think it's the pangolin, you know, should not be facing extinction because people want to eat it. The real reason that the disease spread the way it did was because of the, say, suppression of the media, people's attitudes about the disease, conspiracy theories. In our own country, one of the economically most, you know, strongest countries, the cultural differences and the disconnect between government and people and governance, and the split between, say, conservatives and progressives, I think played more of a role in the spread of the disease than the fact that somebody ate a pangolin someplace. So it's not that I want to defend. I absolutely do not defend the idea that we should be going around with biodiversity, but I do think that it sometimes, and I think I see this with President Trump, keep pointing to China, say that it started there or it was a lab or something like that. That is not why it spread in the United States. And here at New York City, the reason that New York City became the epicenter of the disease has little to do with those other issues. So that's what my sort of contribution is, to sort of take a look at the whole thing holistically and ask, you know, where are the points which really is the cause for the suffering and the deaths. But Daniel, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, you didn't, and I'm glad you went first. That's super interesting, and I think you're exactly right that the food element of it, did someone eat something maybe that they shouldn't have, is not the right question, because, you know, culturally we all have different diets all over the world, and if we were going to try to get people to stop eating bats or pangolins or any type of exotic bushmeat around the world, that's a hard thing to do, especially in countries where people are really hungry. But we do have many more defenses against something like this in this case of COVID and in future pandemics also, which is the tracing, which is public policy, which is fortified health systems that are built and equipped to deal with outbreaks like this very quickly before they spread into worldwide conflagrations and big events. I do think that in the world of climate change, you know, we shouldn't be asking about who's eating what, with the exception, as Shahid said, of maybe endangered species or exotic animals, but more, how more vulnerable are we, right? Warmer temperatures, increased global travel, the prevalence of tropical diseases, transferable diseases, you know, these are all factors that we know are going to increase, and we have the capacity now, as we respond and rebuild after COVID, to strengthen those tools we have, strengthen the systems so that we're in better shape the next time someone does maybe eat something that they shouldn't have eaten and shouldn't have shared. We still have the systems in place to stop it quickly.
Diane, maybe you'd like to add something?
Yes, I think that we have to be super careful with this, or really any crisis, not to abdicate our individual and collective responsibility in our response by blaming, well, that's because this other person, country, people, practice did something that we deem to be wrong. There may be sources of crises that do need to be addressed, but never at the expense of taking responsibility for our care and compassion and policy that protects ourselves and each other. And that's what I think we see happening and not happening in response to COVID, in the disparity of responses happening around the world and even within the United States. So the issues of equity and inequity and simply distribution of resources that affected the outbreak in clustering around New York City, we're also seeing play out very differently with Navajo Nation. Here in the Southwest, where I happen to be calling in from, where we're seeing the numbers of incidents in Navajo Nation outstrip New York City. It's not because everyone's living on top of each other in public transportation, but it is very much about equity and access to information. So the intersectionality that Daniel speaks of in the COVID or really any health or other social crisis that connects back to climate change and inequity can't be simplified as that's because this group did that. And the danger there is not only do we oversimplify, abdicate our own responsibility to respond, but we can deepen the fissures and fault lines that are separating out these issues and our interconnections with each other that may be exacerbating the problem in the first place. So that's going to mean continuing to assert and insist on free speech, free press, free access to information, especially from the science community and especially for the artistic community to be sharing that out.
Yeah.
Juanli, I don't know if you would like to add something, but
I just want to share a little anecdote that ties along with what we're talking, and is that the fact that when we were doing the garden, the first permanent garden of OSS in the Bronx, we started with the idea that the theme, the overarching theme for the garden will be food access. And then after many, many meetings with different community members and stakeholders, we learned that it was not we could not address food access because there was something in between. And it was the fact that like the community needed food literacy. So, and that I think that's like, you know, it ties with like what we are talking here. It's just like, there is no equity. There is no equity on access to information. There is no equity on access to resources. There is no equity on access to health insurance in this country primarily. And that is what is creating this like disproportionate chaos on like who is being affected by this pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you, Juanli. Many other questions cross my mind now, but given the time, let's pass the word to the audience now. We have several questions here. There's one here, which is, what is the best way to instill a sense of environmental ethics in the broader general population?
Can you repeat that? What's the best way to what?
The best way to instill a sense of environmental ethics in the broader general population.
Well,
So
I mean,
maybe you'd like to, or you?
I can answer very fast, and I will let like the rest to like elaborate more. But like what's basic is education. I cannot understand yet why there is no sustainability curriculum about sustainability in middle school, elementary school, high school. Like why those things are not being taught to our younger generations. I teach sustainable systems at the new school, and yeah, we're teaching it at a college level, but what about the younger generations? You know, like I think that's the key for this.
I think there's another level that builds on that with education, teaching sustainability, teaching environmental ethics, and that's those embedded experiences of our interconnection with the environment that make us ethical. It's the growing the gardens, it's diversifying what we eat, it's experimenting with art and science, it's recognizing that we're all Leonardo in some way, and we're all in this together. So looking to animate our education at all ages, from the earliest stages, where children start out very animated. They don't need to be animated and learning things. They want to explore in the earth and touch it and feel it and taste it from the get-go. Then we stamp it out of them. So let's maybe not do that and learn from them how to continue to love our earth and our environment, breathe it in, not just in the classroom or in the 4 years of college, but throughout our whole life. It's not lost on me that this crisis of COVID is a disease that attacks the respiratory system. We have trouble catching our breath. And so that image of Shahid perhaps understanding that if I were looking at the earth, I'd say it has a respiratory problem. We have a respiratory problem. So we're like a microcosm of that right now. And I think we need to be leading by leaning into that experience of our environment so that we can be ethical about it.
If I could expand upon the question, I'd be curious to see what the others think. But living in New York City, and in fact, I grew up in a city, and we're working on a proposal now for urban ecology that right now it's well over half people live in cities, and the projection is that perhaps by 2050, 60% or 70% of people will live in cities. So this means not only the connection to the sort of living world, as I call it, but also even the places where we produce food and agriculture and so forth. That becomes more and more distant, or at least less and less known. A community garden is not the same as a big farm, or green roof is not the same as a rainforest, which provide similar services, but at a much larger scale. So do you feel that urbanization and the increasing sort of disconnect between people and the natural environment, I don't like using the word natural, but sort of the living world, is going to make these ideas of education, communication, new curricula, an effective solution if in fact people are more and more isolated?
I think so. I think the answer is yes, and I think it almost has to be yes. One sort of major optimistic point I find in the whole COVID crisis is this sort of reintroduction to the natural world at a much quicker pace than many of us might have found otherwise. I mean, people all over the world are not only acutely aware that this problem we're having is one of science and of unpreparedness to deal with a matter of science. They've also been enjoying cleaner skies almost everywhere in the world, right? It's very difficult now to buy a bike because people are buying so many bikes and spending so much time outside, to the point that some cities in the United States, in Europe, are shutting some streets to driving at all. And these are changes that might have come eventually, but they're now here, right? And they're starting, and we're sort of confronting a lot of these changes faster and reintegrating with the natural world. And I hope a way that is lasting and sustainable, but certainly it's here now for the present.
Thanks, Daniel. I just wanted to say to our audience that if we don't get to your questions during today's discussion, as we're running out of time, we will try to follow up with a response via email after the program. But we have another question here. It says, what do you do when international organizations overseeing agriculture do not agree on what counts as sustainable agriculture? For some, GMOs are acceptable. For others, only organic agriculture solutions. So what are your thoughts on this? Maybe Shahid?
Well, I happen to be working on a primer, which is very odd. I'm working on a primer of sustainable agriculture. So it's just an introduction. But as an ecologist, I had to learn a lot of stuff I'd never learned before. I suppose we never stopped being students. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting in my reading was this problem that if you have this inequity, you have lots and lots of poor people, especially living in slums and cities. And they can't afford, the kind of food that's you would buy at Whole Foods. It's organic, that's, low production, but high quality. They need the cheaper, durable foods that green revolution or industrial type agriculture can produce. On the other hand, the number of farmers who actually run those farms is very few. They tend to be the richer farmers. And the vast majority of farmers, I forget how many there are, but millions of farmers actually have small plots of land that can't actually produce a lot of food that can be exported or sold at the very, very cheap rates. So I feel this is sort of a, paradox or a problem. How do you get out of this? In that if people don't have economic resources to buy higher quality food, and then they need the cheaper, lower quality food that's produced industrially, how do you solve that problem without getting rid of the original problem, and the base problem, which is that of inequity, which is a huge social problem and not so much, I think, a natural science problem. But that's sort of my thought about the problems of dealing with food justice, food equity, is that we're sort of in this trap, especially as the number of people in the world who are poor seems to be increasing, not decreasing.
Diana, maybe you'd like to add something? Or...
Well, I heard, those are interesting and good points. I heard the question differently. In responding to the question about, well, what do you do if you're getting mixed messages from international agencies? Assume and expect you were going to get mixed messages. That's part of being informed and mindful global citizen and having systems that protect access to that information and free speech is to sift through some of the messaging to make an informed response. And I think we have to, maybe to bring that question together with Shahid's response, recognize that we may not get it perfect. We may not have a perfect solution right now. We're moving towards something that's more equitable. We're moving towards something that's more diverse and that's healthier. So if we are looking at projections, say up to 60% urban, we're already 50% or just over 50% of our world's population in cities. Not everyone's going to have a big expansive farmland to grow their food, but we can do better. We can get the information that may not all be universally agreed. Here are the 5 steps you need to do, but from this source and that source and one more, and my own intuition in my neighborhood or my neighbors in my apartment building, I have these 3 things I know I could start with. I can start by making different choices. I can start by sharing more equitably. I can start, we're seeing, as Daniel said, in COVID, people are not only buying bikes, or you can't buy bikes, but you can't find yeast in stores either because people are staying home and they're baking, and we're cooking, we're consuming differently. We're consuming very, very differently, and we're sharing that consumption differently. So we can begin and start where we are and recognize that we may not have perfect solution, but that doesn't absolve us from taking interim steps, including in cities. And that may well be where new forms of art that Juanli was speaking about come in, because we can imagine and build new experiences of our natural world through technology in our urban centers.
Thank you. There's another question here. It says, will even the most progressive governments around the world abandon climate change mitigation given COVID-19? Will they prioritize economic rehabilitation instead?
I want to give other people a chance to answer, but I have to say that what I hope will happen is that we'll recognize that this isn't a zero-sum game, that this isn't an either or. Either we mitigate climate change, or we rehabilitate the economy, or we deal with COVID. That we recognize these are dependent on each other. That we have to be moving toward restoring resilience of the planet. Means regeneration and reimagination of our systems, our economic system, our climate, our relationship to climate, and our health systems.
Yeah,
I think Diana is exactly, and I'm sorry, Juanli, just one sec. I think Diana's right that, you know, countries that choose one road over another will maybe find success down that one road, but the countries that are the most successful in the coming decades, I think, are the ones that find a strategy that encompasses all three. How can we respond to pandemics? How can we grow our economy and fight climate change? And that's a very hard equation to balance, but it can be balanced. And I think the countries that do that will be the main powerhouses of the future. Juanli?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to agree with Diana and yourself, Daniel. I think that, like, talking about the first trip around the world and like how we started globalization with this commercial route, we can't forget that globalization, even though our current systems are only focusing on the commercial and the economic value of globalization, globalization happened at all levels, right? It happened gastronomically, it happened for biodiversity, for microbials, as we discussed last week. It happened for every level. And like, that is the issue. It's like, we can't stop looking at one of those subjects. It's like, we have to like focus that like globalization is for good and for bad in many levels, and is affecting climate change, is affecting the economy, is affecting biodiversity, so the way that we interact with each other, the way that we eat, the way that we consume, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be a huge mistake, and like, unfortunately, we are seeing it happening, and or at least that's like my impression. It's like there's days that I feel differently, but like I don't know. I mean, I think that hopefully when we get a little more perspective on all this crisis, governments will like realize that it's very important to address climate change.
Yeah, so what Daniel said reminds me of my thought that one thing that COVID-19 did, so in conservation, we have this thing called the shifting baseline, which each generation has a different sense of what the environment is. So if you grew up in Los Angeles and you're used to smog, that to you is, is the normal, right? And one thing about COVID-19 is that I remember watching this European Space Agency video about the changes, some of which you were talking about, is that some people in India for the first time were able to see the Himalayan mountains because the air was actually clear. And in Los Angeles, the younger generation for the first time saw the smog gone. And I think, also when I've been hiking around, seeing more people in parks than have ever been before. And I think that's part because the malls are closed and everything else is closed. But I wonder, if one of the things about the shifting baseline is that this actually created a pause, so that the new generation can actually see the actual impact that we have on the world. So what the plug is now is that, okay, we've now seen our impact visibly. This is what this has done. Now we want to move forward, and we want to move forward, but to do so sustainably, and to actually see if we can keep the air in Los Angeles clean, still see the view of the Himalayan mountains, and maybe the younger generation will now be more motivated than the older generation, which is really something the shifting baseline. But my thought, getting back, just bringing it together about international agencies, is like one of the things that guides us is the Sustainable Development Goals, and at least all the countries have signed on to. And when I look at it, there's 17 goals, only 2 of them are really environmental, right? And it's almost as, and they're also followed separately, as if somehow gender equity, universal education, and poverty alleviation can all be done separately from the 2 environmental one, which is one is the land and the other is the marine. And for me as an ecologist, the fact that they disconnected land from the marines is really something they shouldn't have done in the first place as well. So if we have the guidelines coming from the United Nations, and I don't know how much people stick to the Sustainable Development Goals, I do feel that the messages, getting back to the first question, are a little confused. But we have a younger generation that is actually getting a chance to see that the shifting baseline is something they should not accept. They should actually come up with a new baseline. Then moving forward, we'll be better informed by both the science and the art and the communication of this generation than what's been said before.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And as we are out of time, I am passing again the word to Juanli Carrión, who, as he mentioned, is the creator of this multidisciplinary project around nature, made in collaboration with the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy. I would like to give him a couple of minutes for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Blanca, for leading us through this necessary and complex conversation. There is so much to be said, and then thank you as well to Shahid, to Daniel, to Diana, for it was an honor for me to share this panel with you. Thank you for such wonderful contributions, and I hope the audiences shares with me the excitement and the urgency of everything that we have discussed. Mostly the fact that we are not trading with nature. We never were, and we will never will. And it's just more that like we are part of this nature, right? And as such, we must act like it. I want to thank you, the whole team at the Cultural Office of the Spanish Embassy, Ander Lopez, Ana Fernandez, Sofia Lucini, Vanessa Peña, Alberto Saavedra, and especially to Ernesto Coro, with whom I have been working hand in hand for the past year in the development of Around Nature. Thank you also to the National Academy of Science, JD Talasek, Alana Quinn, and Moises Ramirez. And most importantly, thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the attendees for listening and for your questions and participation that contributed to enrich the conversation enormously. So we will continue this conversation next week with the last panel of the symposium, discussing about the core of our civilization, food. We already talked about food. It's inevitable that we talk about food in this panel, in the panel last week. We are always talking about food, right? It's like we're eating it and we love food. So I hope you will join us to talk about like global food economies of the past, the present, and the future. And we will focus on food and technology, alternative food systems, and the loss of cultural food practices as a consequence of globalization. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, wherever you are, and I ask you to please continue to be safe, compassionate, and healthy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.